Rick and Morty comic issue 14. Rick gets called out for something as the family's trapped in a tall metal tower by aliens, and he points out that he had saved Morty's life. Twice. It doesn't really count for much since he always saves him from the danger he put him in the first place, though. Summer says that she really thought she lost him for good. Then Rick points out that he's actually saved the Earth plenty of times. But since he's mentioning a bunch of aliens, shouldn't it be obvious to him that those aliens only would have attacked such a backwoods planet by following him because of all his zone hopping? He calls them out on not having faith that he knows what he's doing, and he surprisingly looks downcast when Beth asks what he is doing, proving that he knows she has a point. He is pretty motiveless in wasting his genius. And then someone Rick hates asks him the same question. Considering the conversation they're having, you could forget that they're not still in their garage because they're completely ignoring the aliens and just talking about what happened earlier without their involvement. So clearly they do still have some faith in Rick because they're that used to aliens and assume he'll just get them out of this dangerous situation. Then Alien Overlord with the cape says that what Rick's been doing has been a subject of much discussion among the most smart and dedicated of the flock. And he's speaking like those people who spied on Rick are religious and formed a religion around him. Which would make more sense than most, since they know he actually exists, and is very capable. He says that Rick is a being of great works, and many benefit, and many tremble. He just seemed like he was calling him out on wasting his time, and now he's complimenting him? Did he not listen to the conversation? Which clearly proved that he was a flawed person? Rick doesn't take him seriously after all his experience in life, and just tells him John Savely to speed things up because he's got a family meeting to get to, apparently. I love the apparently there. The Emperor speaks too formally. I mean, split in twain? Really? I guess he's outdated on how English is spoken. It's harder to follow what he's saying and motivate myself to read it all, which is a big problem for a comic. How many people severely skimmed over or skipped his pretentious dialogue? Blah blah blah, his planet's people had a great civilization but they started to war, and somehow there are only two sides on the entire planet, each opposed to the other's faith. Where have I heard this before? Oh right, every planet. So what is this special? Apparently the war engulfs suns and worlds. What, with nukes? I can understand suns, but worlds? Things would have to be pretty bad to result in actual nukes being fired. I mean, it hasn't happened to us at this point, when I was worried it would 4 years ago. So his people discovered a greater power of destruction than they ever could have imagined. His toaster detector. And followed it to Rick as one people. I guess sucking up to him by calling him a messiah. Fortunately, Rick says, "No thanks, I'm not political." This is what makes him a better person than Eggman. He's better than most villains, because you'd expect an evil scientific genius to want to take over the world and run it how he pleases. But at least he's got a standard. And that shred of morality is what keeps him a sympathetic and bearable protagonist. Jerry asks Rick what's wrong with him since they destroyed a city, apparently, because of his toaster. I guess his point is Rick should be feeling guilty. But why'd they destroy a city? What would that accomplish? Jerry says this isn't his fault. I guess his point is that he didn't have any way of knowing that messing with his toaster would attract aliens to him. And Rick made it. Rick makes him cower immediately as he tries too hard to threaten him, and Beth just looks snarky. Even the Emperor says to stop because this is beneath him. And I giggled when Rick actually snarked, "You got that right." Because he was trying to insult him and he just agreed. Then Jerry gets called out for questioning Rick, even though the Emperor just questioned Rick. The alien overlord is baffled to learn that the holy power was in fact a toaster scanner. An experiment to see if Rick could make the most useless thing in the world, a toaster, perfect. Why does he think it's useless? It's there to make a meal. Let alone the most useless thing ever. Isn't he supposed to be smart? He says he doesn't even like toast because it's just double cooked bread. As opposed to my reason that it's bread in the first place. I swear, bread tasted better when I was younger. Since Rick doesn't like toast, and naturally that'd mean he wouldn't be a proper judge, I guess that's why he used all the Mortys ever as a nexus to calibrate against. It was sweet when he said that basically he made it for him, and Morty was like, "Aw, thanks Rick." The aliens glare at Jerry for apparently breaking the toaster earlier, and Jerry amusingly looks cowardly when he says that he just likes bread darker. Good thing the dialogue's so entertaining, because so far the story has had nothing get done, and has just been the characters talking. But unlike a certain other comic, I'm actually enjoying myself because the dialogue's so funny. I giggled at Rick's over-the-top angry reaction of nowhere. Nobody likes it darker, Jerry. That's like quadruple cooked bread. That's even more pointless. It's so relatable seeing him get frustrated over something ultimately minor because he's only human. Surprisingly, the aliens all crowd Jerry and say that surely he's the one because he brought the aliens to his planet. And Rick uses them as a distraction to try to leave with his family. Lucky for him, they aren't objecting, surprisingly. Oh, now Beth objects. Beth of all people. Out of nowhere, some green tentacles come out of the ceiling and grab the family one by one. And Rick makes a portal in an alien and goes through it without Morty, surprisingly, telling him to keep running. It's not like him to abandon him and have faith that he'll be fine after his sacrifice in the Foxfire Labyrinth. But it's in the heat of the moment. There isn't any time. He's not really thinking. There's a tentacle between him and Morty right now, and maybe he just has a lot of faith in him. Morty runs around just to get to some aliens who speak overly formally, and they really do talk way too much. In fact, I remember that when I first read the comic, I actually skipped most of their dialogue and was thankful that they got what they deserved for that painfully unfunny running gag. We don't need to be reminded that their people have been at war for a long time. They reveal, pointlessly, that over the generations of war, they reframe the conflict into one that's helpful to their goals. Progress comes from a dependable economy, and they kept the war over blind faith going because it helped the economy. I mean, war did get us out of the Great Depression. It really would be a better experience if what they were talking about was illustrated, instead of nothing but us seeing them talking to Morty in small panels where nothing's going on. We could see people arguing instead of just them sitting Morty in a chair. Logically, why are they telling Morty this? Well, I guess because they're just so desperate to brag about their smart plan after so long keeping it a secret that they'll tell anyone they can get away with telling. They're talking way too long about this plan, they're just repeating themselves. I got it after the first panel. This is supposed to be annoying, but intentionally bad is still bad. Basically, they're saying that the two sides middle class have started finally asking if the other side is really that bad. What took so long? What changed? How would that happen at this point? These guys might as well be one character, and that'd be less annoying. They get along too well. They're so similar that I'm saying they to refer to both of them. Their point is that they think they need Rick to be the master of the toaster, a voice through which they can continue planning for their people. And they have a problem with Rick saying no thanks. Morty is shown his family, who are threatened if he doesn't do what they say and rat out Rick. He's told that they'll be allowed to keep enjoying a good long standard of living if they get Rick to see the benefits for him and his family. Why do they want Rick to cooperate again? Why do they think they can have any real power over Rick? So naturally, Rick shoots them. About time! We could have just had them skip to the last few panels with them. They know Morty already knows most of this. Sure was sweet of Rick to come back to save Morty after all. It makes way more sense than him actually going home through the portal without him. He says he's glad he found Morty, and had to shoot a lot of guys to get here, even though we see a portal right here on the wall. He then goes on a kinda interesting tangent that this species of alien has 7 different genders biologically. How would he know that? I guess he's already familiar with this species of alien through his space adventuring. He's told to open the door, and all of his lengthy talking about a plan of his to recharge his portal gun at the main power supply was just a waste of time to read, because before he could do anything, the Emperor smashes through the door. Then we should have just seen him smash through the door right away if he could do it so easily. We see all the family together in one room, with Jerry having a leg of his injured and needing Summer to walk. The Emperor threatens them with a ray gun because his people had gone through so much war and they're ready to see a better future for themselves because of one of them taking an artifact and agreeing to rule over them. What kind of Emperor would gladly give up his own job to someone else? Is he really that insecure that he thinks he can't just end the war by royal decree or something? If Morty of all people, and not Rick, is trusted to bring them to a great future when he's just a teenage boy, then how does that make sense just because Rick made a super powerful and dangerous device they detected? Rick I could understand because he's a genius, but Morty hasn't even proven himself to be an especially good person, let alone smart. Did he just pick at random? The Emperor almost just discovered Rick and his family. Why would he already be this blindly devoted to the brand new religion that he'd gladly give up his power to one of them? I guess people can be really stupid in real life too, and his job is probably really time consuming and a lot of pressure, so maybe that's why he wants a vacation. He should say that. But of all the people, you'd think the only one he'd consider other than Rick is Beth. Because Jerry's incompetent, and Morty's just a teenager that Rick treats like an idiot. He has them cornered and surrounded by hostile aliens with no escape. Why did he suddenly change his mind about getting Rick to agree to this? He doesn't know that Rick might just say no anyways and call his bluff. But I get where he's going with this, in the sense that Morty seems like a pure and innocent kid because he's the youngest. Which is a nice change of pace from the worst of leaders out there. He doesn't seem like he'd be corrupt, but he'd just be assuming that. He knows nothing about him. He doesn't say that he knows him inside and out. It was nice of Beth to hug Morty, by the way. Of course, Morty says yes to being a ruler because it seems like he's not being given a real choice. It looks like this is the only way for him and his family to survive the situation. And he's been constantly told that if the aliens are left alone by him, they'll end up getting themselves killed. The Emperor even said that they might burn the land beneath them to set off anew. So him agreeing to something as immoral looking as this probably saved a lot of lives. So it's technically the right thing. It's just not something that looks like the right thing because he became a dictator from it. We get to 180 years later, and all the family seems to be the same age, implying that they were made immortal through technology somehow. Good thing they survived all that time without dying of a disease or assassination attempt or getting hit by a car or whatever. Huh, Morty has a bunch of little Jessica dolls near him. This is the kind of thing we should have seen from Ugly Morty, because it's unique to Morty's character. He's told by an alien that he's respected, and his name spreads peace wherever it's spoken, and it's blossomed across the sector. What helps keep Morty sympathetic here is that he looks unhappy, rather than being cocky and acting like he's enjoying being in power and abusing it for all it's worth, or acting cold-hearted. So the writing is aware of the moral ambiguity here, in having a likable protagonist in this kind of role. Again, Ugly Morty would have been more sympathetic and less confusing if he was like this. You'd think that after all this time, though, Morty would have ordered people like this guy to stop speaking so obnoxiously formally, and 2, told people to stop calling him overly fancy titles like your worship when he was never comfortable with it. And 3, tell them to get his name right. Why the apostrophe in D in Morty? How'd they screw that up? Then the alien seems to be trying to sugarcoat how they don't necessarily treat people right when they try to convert them to their so-called peace. I mean, at least they're trying to stop war, but aren't they warring because of it? And apparently Summer has a boyfriend, sort of. If they're really in power, why can't they order the aliens to stop obligating them to say, all saying the beneficence of his name and continents every time they say Morty? Why can't they order the aliens to stop obligating them to put Mighty behind Morty's name? Realistically, if they're really in power, they won't have to humor these pushy idiots. And they would at least try to stop by now. Anyways, Jerry tells Summer that she knows Morty doesn't like it when she teases the servants, who he calls the help, which is nice of Morty. And she's snarky with him and says she's gonna see if there's any new meat in the slave pits. It took me a while to realize that she didn't mean meat literally, and was instead referring to slaves to date her. I see, she's been corrupted. It does make sense that a teenager with her hormones would insist on always being able to keep dating. And how else would she be able to have a constant supply of human men to date in a world of aliens? This is the only way she can cope with her life. Morty's told about an uprising, the demolition of indigenous temples on several worlds, the sculpting of his image on their moons, and is reminded about the threats to his life. All he tells them to do is sort all those things out themselves, as he wants to go to his room for today. Which is a subtle way of showing us that he doesn't like the pressure of being in charge. It's a good way to contrast him from Evil Morty and Ugly Morty. He's acting relatable. But it'd be much more relatable if he actually used his power to order them not to sculpt his image on people's moons when they clearly hate that. And why doesn't he order them to just call him Morty? And just call Jerry Jerry instead of Your Holiness? That's dumb. It's like he doesn't get that he's in power after 180 years. Imagine how different Earth would be by this point. This is very gutsy of the comic to do, implying that the lives of its protagonists were radically altered for such a long time, and so quickly too. You'd think someone as humble as Morty would tell them that he doesn't need a statue or a bust of himself or a painting of himself in his palace. He's so used to avoiding assassination attempts by this point that he isn't even scared because he knows he'll somehow be fine, since he survived up to this point, miraculously. So he effortlessly avoids the attacks of the bladed ninjas while simply looking depressed. It's unrealistic that he wouldn't look scared or serious at this point. He nonchalantly calls for his guards and shows morality by telling someone not to kill his guards for this. Of course, I hate the needless gore as usual. He says to take them to his mother, and that he needs at least one of them alive and talking, and implies that she tortures to get information, which is weird since she should be smart enough to know that torture just encourages lying, saying whatever they want to hear to humor the person, so it doesn't actually work. She's just stressed out and spiteful, like the eye patch Beth. And of course, it turns out that his bed has not even one, but two different Jessica lookalikes for him. Although they have tails and weird ears and noses. I guess there were failed attempts at cloning her and he was nice enough to accept them because the alternative was them getting killed. Or they're from another dimension, even though he doesn't have Rick's portal gun. I guess he asked them to. Why is one not enough for him? One girlfriend would already be overwhelming. This at least makes perfect sense for his character to do with all that power. But everything else, he seems to be, if anything, robbed of his agency. Because if he was really doing what he wanted, things would be a lot different because he's not okay with being worshipped and people being punished for not converting. He'd rather be at home and live his life, watch TV. Is he really that in power if he can't actually do what he wants for the most part because he's just that afraid of the aliens? It's more like they're being held hostage. Maybe that's why he's depressed. Evil Morty and Ugly Morty wouldn't have that problem. They just did what they wanted without being afraid. And they wanted to be in power. Morty's told that the prisoner has been delivered to the throne room for questioning, and is asked if they should proceed. The throne room? Then we see Beth and Jerry arguing because Beth is dating someone with a horse for a head, who apparently respects her autonomy and doesn't wear her down like he did. Huh? Also, realistically, a human like her would never date him. Well, there are furries, but I mean the chances would be ridiculously low. Summer can date human guides whenever she wants. Though even then, I have trouble believing she'd actually comply with treating them like slaves when she's the one in power over the aliens. But yeah, couldn't Beth just ask for a human instead? It's also impossible to believe that Beth would agree to having a terrible hairstyle and outfit. Let alone that Jerry would wear an outfit like that. For like the 5th time, if the family is really in power, why can't they opt out of any of this? Beth at least reveals that she's reached her potential as a genius that she inherited from Rick, because she says that she's got a prisoner wired with a machine that keeps him from lying. He can't use his creativity, and his head is covered with electrical nodes that'll fire if there's any delay in giving a straight answer, so he'll literally tell the truth at the press of a button. I really hate the expression she has. It's so derpy, it's creepy. This is interesting. It's engaging to have such a radical change of pace for an episodic formulaic series. It was polite of Morty to thank her. It's admirable to see that even after a century of being a dictator, he hasn't really let the power go to his head like Summer seems to have. Because he still hasn't forgotten his manners, even though he doesn't need to remember them. It's so annoying that the prisoner insists on talking too formally and cryptically. Like, why say tyranny of his radiance instead of just tyranny for someone you're opposed to? He wastes a bunch of time saying the same basic thing over and over, that, go figure, his mission was to kill Morty. I mean, if they said that the reason they think he's the false one is because he's not Rick, who was originally hyped up, that would make more sense. I mean, I said earlier that he's the least logical choice. But now I've been shown that he's the best possible choice because he's the most moral out of all his family. Beth has no loyalty to her husband, for example. I'm sure he's a wimp, but if she really loved him, then she would love her husband for that anyways. And accept him for who he is. Anyways, he just says that his rule is false and the screams go unheard and the blackness offers hope. Why does he have to say blackness instead of just the end of the rule? Normally, blackness would mean death in a cryptic sense. I guess he's talking about the forced conversions being too mean. He looks like evil Morty wearing black and looking annoyed at him. At least he's open-minded and humble enough to ask him why the end of his rule offers hope. But somehow, all that the prisoner says is that it all hurts, which Morty should also know by heart by now. He was told about an uprising. He should know how those are dealt with. Why is he wasting time? His viceroy has a point in telling him to stop wasting questions, but he's just as stupid as Morty. He asked what the mission of the group is when they made it obvious 600 times that it's to kill Morty. Also, if Morty is really in power, why is the Viceroy brave enough to do this when he's not in charge? Then he asks the prisoner how the group plans to bring about the end of the rule and who the leader is. Why does he say life eternal? He's not French. He says in an obnoxiously formal way that I guess was the whole joke with this issue, but it wasn't funny, so it wasn't worth it. He basically says that the misleadingly named group wants to bring Rick back after he was cast off. And Jerry says good riddance. Then it turns out that the leader of the rebel group was Jerry all along. So we actually get to see him as a traitor after last issue subverted it. We didn't need the overly exaggerated gore when he killed what was apparently best boyfriend. If he had such a problem with the family's new life, what took him so long to snap? 140 years or whatever is a pretty long time. He sure loves his son to have taken this long to set up a rebel group against him. But you'd think that if he wanted to kill him, he could just go to his room and do when he's asleep because he lives with him and is the last person they'd suspect. They just blame it on one of the many assassins. He could have done this in a smarter way than this. At least it's really satisfying and cathartic to see him rant about all this. It was also satisfying to see the unlikable Viceroy get killed off. Beth accuses him of being petty, asking if he's really so small after all this time, after he reveals that he's so driven over the edge that he has an extinction-level mega bomb. He complains about the day this arc all started, and he complains about not getting any respect from his family. Totally unself-aware of the fact that he clearly wouldn't deserve the respect anymore since he's using the toaster scanner as a bomb to threaten with. I mean, seriously, if they're really in power, why don't they just go home? I guess since the aliens kidnapped them from home effortlessly at first, they didn't have that option and would literally have to destroy their planet just to be free of the aliens. So Morty put up with the aliens because it'd be more moral that way. But the toaster thing is a universe threatener, not just a planet threatener. Jerry gets defeated by the ray gun of a guard in an overly gory way. And it turns out Rick showed up, with a long beard and what seems like a mecha he's in. But it's actually a mostly robotic version of his body. What took him so long to come here? Shouldn't he have known Morty would want to leave and go home? Logically, you'd think with his attachment to Morty, he wouldn't have been able to stand living without his assistance for even a week, and would have just kidnapped his family back and blown the planet up or something. He doesn't explain that he made a replacement for Morty all that time. The writer really wanted to write this whole scenario where the family was a royal family so much that he didn't think about whether it made sense. He holds an exhausted Morty in his giant robot hands, as I wonder how he would have ever put up with such hands when they'd be too big for engineering. How would even just his head still be alive after that long? Did he get given the immortality potion we never saw the existence of, just like the rest of his family? My point is, the only reason he would have mostly roboticized himself in all this time would be to prevent his death from old age. Even though Rick is known for being a death seeker in the show. But his head is still organic, so they wouldn't have survived for that long. But he wouldn't make himself this way for the practical purpose because his robotic body's too big to be practical. He wouldn't be able to do anything with those hands. Was the writer just doing this to be weird and shocking for the sake of, comedy? Because this is just confusing, to the point where it's taking me longer to progress with the plot. And that's Sonic levels of illogical writing. Anyways, if I can try to make sense of this, Rick says that somehow Jerry did something that caused the bomb to be cross-linked through the toaster to feed off the energy from an infinite number of counterpart toaster scanners. Yeah, how did Jerry do it? That's another reason this plot wouldn't have gone the way it did. We weren't told that Jerry spent a really long time studying science so that he could be just as good at it as Rick. Although that'd be kind of plausible considering he had over 100 years to do it. The only possible option for a person smart enough to do any successful modifications on that toaster was Rick. And he left instead of staying with the family being a hedonist. And did nothing to try to get Morty back, which was completely out of character. It turns out Rick warns everyone that the toaster bomb will wipe out the whole galaxy and then some. And he gets Morty an hourglass sort of thing that his robotic body suddenly changed into, abandoning his family out of nowhere and just trying to save the injured Morty. Why doesn't he use a portal gun to get Morty and his family to another universe? Instead he didn't do that, for no actual reason. Then after they both get destroyed, with no explanation as to why their heads survived, so that story was all pointless, we see Morty saying that he can't believe all that happened in another universe with another Rick and Morty in the head of another Rick and Morty from another timeline. This is confusing because I thought what happened was that the Rick and Morty we knew came out of the head universe, and then were immediately confronted with the aliens and their confused family, and this whole plot happened. But apparently all this dictator family stuff was suddenly just a story of the Rick and Morty that they went through the memories of. I mean, old Rick looks nothing like the Rick that Jerry discovered, because he had a long beard. So how could he have been the Rick that Jerry discovered? Apparently, as I struggled to understand this writing like it's the worst of Penders, it turns out that even though they were sent out of the Morty head, we were tricked because they were still in the memory of the other Morty. So it turns out that the other Morty's memory also involved going into the memory of an alternate universe Morty and out of it. And then that led to the story with the royal family. The writer then has Morty lampshade that the snapback is a narratively convenient, lazy deus ex machina. This is a bit too much breaking the fourth wall. He wouldn't say this. But he's got a point, because the whole reason the snapback could happen is that we were tricked into thinking them escaping the Morty head meant something that didn't. It sure is quite a coincidence that the other Rick and Morty that were doomed to that fate also found a Rick and Morty that they went to the heads of, who had the same thing happen to them to make them that way. And he asks how they're supposed to prevent all of that from happening to them. And Rick ruffles his head, sweetly calling him little guy. We needed that. Anyways, the way they prevent the cycle from repeating in their universe is that Rick slaps Jerry and gets his toaster back. And the story ends with our time being wasted. He doesn't tell us what those small but vital upgrades to the Rick head before they even went in were. So that was pointless. Why is he going to keep the heads around? This was kind of a terrible story. How can it be good if I just have a cocked eyebrow for most of it from confusion? It was really hard to take in and contrived by the second half. The first part of it is great. There's some good tension and an interesting premise. The aliens think too highly of Rick because of how powerful his toaster scanner is. But logically, after Rick told the Emperor what the device really was, the plot would have just ended there. It was exciting to see the family try to run away from the aliens, but there is a reason I completely forgot what happened on the way to those annoying twins talking way too much and wasting comic space after the first time I read the story. And it's because the family all get kidnapped by a tentacle out of nowhere one by one. That's it. They could have just saved a lot of space in the story by immediately cutting to Morty being made the dictator after Rick said, "No thanks," in the same room. Because Morty literally just ran away for a bit, and then sat in a room and people talked his ear off. Almost nothing happened in between all that. The first half was good in the typical entertaining dialogue Rick and Morty way. But the second half is where the plot really becomes forced enough that it goes beyond nitpicks I can look past. Because at that point it's about being dark, with no actual charm to make up for it. There's no way the Emperor would easily abdicate the throne in favor of anyone. Especially not Morty, who he barely knows, unless he was just that desperate to get a break from a taxing job like being the Emperor. That would have been one sentence to explain. More importantly, there's no way that what's apparently an alternate universe Rick all along would have put up with Morty being away ruling an alien planet with his family instead of adventuring with him for even a single week, let alone 185 years. That is wildly out of character. It would be one sentence to explain that he made a fake new Morty, like cashed in his Morty coupon. It wouldn't be so confusing if we weren't told that Rick left the alien world, meaning he had no excuse to come back. He wouldn't have enough time to come back. I guess he got sick of being told he couldn't endanger Morty by taking him on adventures anymore. But then he would have immediately come back with a planet bomb, not just gotten a new Morty and only come back a century later for no explained reason. There's also no explained reason for why the family became immortal. But at least that can be explained away as maybe they got an immortality potion, because this is a sci-fi series where anything can happen, but it's still baffling that we weren't told that. But even if they did become immune to aging, the fact remains that it's impossible to believe that they would have avoided any other means of death in all that time, like the assassination attempts, disease, or even killing themselves from boredom because their lives would be basically the same for the next century with them not being allowed to make any real change or progress. So that's still a plot hole that always confused me. Especially since Jerry hated his life and Beth cheating on him, so he wouldn't have put up with all this for that long. What took him so long to make that bomb a thing? Why did he think making a universe bomb was a good idea? It's not even explained that it just took that long for him to study enough science to know how to make that bomb a thing. Or someone else did it. I guess the logic was he just completely snapped and was just that spiteful. Because otherwise, you'd think he'd just kill himself long before doing this. The only thing good about all this was that it reaffirmed how good a person Morty actually is. Even in that position, he didn't let the power go to his head, and was relatable and uncomfortable with all of it. But really, they're not really in power if they can't do what they actually want and leave the planet and return to their normal lives. Or else the aliens would just come get them again. They're not really in power if the aliens would just turn down Morty if he ordered them to let him go home. There's not even a thought bubble from the Viceroy saying that he's the one really in power, and they know it. And apparently Morty was way too afraid of the aliens' retribution and stubbornness, because he didn't even order them to do the stuff anybody would order them to do right away. Like stop referring to him with fancy titles and putting his image everywhere and being violent with people and forcing his father and mother to wear terrible clothes. All of that he should be able to put a stop to. At that point, is he just a figurehead? I never saw him make an actual legal decision. He was just told stuff and told the servants to sort out things themselves. So then they're in power, and they should know this and realize that their chosen one isn't actually doing what they want him to do. But I guess they're fine with that because they're power hungry. On the bright side, it turns out that all of this nonsense happened to an alternate universe version of Rick's family, and not the comic version. But we should have just been told that from the start. We were wondering what happened to make the other Rick and Morty heads attached to wires, and the previous issue didn't do anything to explain it. So we could have been told that we'd get that answer. Even then, we didn't get that answer. There's no reason anything would have been left of that universe. We could have had one text box saying, but little did they know that when they emerged from the memory center of the other Morty, they were still experiencing his memory. It's like Inception. Instead, it's like, they tricked me. It was all really big coincidence that this memory hopping happened in two universes. And they only tell you that and how they tricked you in one overly long text bubble from Morty after the fact, constrained to one panel. Rick tells you not to think about it, but that's not fair to the audience because you have to try to make sense of it to have any chance of forgiving the story for how confusing that sudden revelation is. You have to think about it to make sense of what Morty said. The panel contradicts a rule because why didn't the head explode after they got out of it? I guess that was the vital upgrade Rick talked about in the end, and that's how they got out of there with the two heads being intact. I hate how many times this arc forced me to talk about heads. It's way too macabre for me. The issue really went overboard in the gore for no actual reason. Censorship is not always bad. They could have still told the same story, they even had the same dialogue, without things being confusing to interpret, if they didn't show that stuff and just told us the character was killed off. I don't see the actual point of drawing it like that, because I doubt it was meant to be a joke. And a way to kill off Jerry that would have been cathartic would have been something more painful without innocent death. Something more slapstick cartoony and drawn out. Like, I don't know, he could have been fired out of a cannon and like fallen down a bunch of rooftops. It was interesting to read. It was a fascinating and gutsy change of pace that the characters were reimagined in a royal family role. Like, what would they do in those positions? That was worth it for how it was portraying Morty's character. And they were smart enough to want to do it. But other than that, this was easily the most baffling story in the comics so far.